Today is June 24th, I think, and I've been wanting for some time to make a record of my own personal involvement with bears and bear stories, and I thought I'd do it today. Sean's helping me, and so I'll start it with this. Bears, 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 and more bears. I grew up, of course, hearing the popular story of Goldilocks and the three bears, the three little pigs, the Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf and all of that stuff. And after Barry and David were grown up enough that Marge would start to tell them bedtime stories, she started to tell them one time, and Barney said, "Oh no, you don't do that. You're not going to teach my boys, have my boys grew up being afraid of bears and wolves and things like that." And so in his opinion, it turned out, in my opinion, it turned out great. Those boys grew up in Island Park in the summer, never afraid to walk in the woods. My first experience with a bear, I was 7 years old. We lived that summer, my first summer, in Island Park. About halfway between the sawmill and the camp was the barn. It was a large barn with a loft, and one time my niece Eleanor Hess and Ren South's oldest girl Glenna were playing, and they walked from their house up to the barn, which was about halfway between the sawmill and the camp. They're playing there, and there was a garbage pit in a kind of a clearing just to the east side of the barn, and they thought there was a dog in the garbage. They saw it there and never thought much about it. Then all of a sudden, one of them realized, probably Glenna, she is older, that's a bear. So they ran back down to the camp and to their house, which was Ren South's house at that time, and told their mother and Ruth South, and Ruth hurried and got all of the kids up into her house. They had a little porch on the front. She got us all up there and into the house and told us not to go outside and to stay there. And then she went outside and walked out past the edge of the timber to the edge of the flat and ran up all the way about a quarter of a mile to the sawmill. She went to the sawmill and went over and told Barney there was a bear down at the barn at the garbage dump. So I can remember we were all in the house, and here came Barney down the road going really fast in a little old Oldsmobile coupe that they had the first year they were married and living there. Grabbed his gun, which is a Winchester 25-20, and went hurrying back up the road in his car to the sawmill, and there he met my father and whoever else was working there on the crew that day, would have included my brother Al. And my dad took a 22 that they had, an old 22 that belonged to Barney, that they had kept it at the cabin they stayed in at the sawmill. My dad, Al, and I slept in that cabin. It was just a slab cabin. Had 2 rooms in it. We all slept in the same bed in the back room. Anyway, he took his 22 and went down to the barn looking all around, and Barney hurried back down with his rifle, and they looked around for quite a long time, and they never could find any bear. And so that was my first experience, anything to do with the bear. My father kept this old 22 of Barney's there at the sawmill. There was an old guy named Ed Krause, and he lived over on a homestead, an old homestead, at the far end of the Island Park Flat, just where the road to Trail Canyon leaves the Sagebrush Flat and goes up into the mountains there, up into the woods. And Ed Krause had some dogs that ran loose. And sometimes my dad would get up early in the morning and they'd look out, and those dogs would be sleeping in the mill shed up near the sawyer's box in the sawdust. they were just loose like feral dogs that roamed around all over. And so my dad, I remember one time he shot at them, I think. But anyway, if he could have shot one or two of them, he'd have been glad to, because they didn't like them just loose running around everywhere. There were two homesteads up at that end of the flat. One of them was called the Vanoy place, and they had taken some water from where it comes down out of Split Creek, diverted it over a little ways into the bottom of the Trail Canyon Road, and built a little pond. And in Targhee Thai days, my father told me that the Vanoys had some geese in that pond in the summertime. And then next to the Vanoy place was another homestead called the Clark place. On the Clark place there was a kind of a meadow, and the Clark Canyon ran parallel to the Trail Canyon with just one mountain, low mountain in between the two canyons. So if you went up that canyon, you could go up over the hill and into the next canyon, over into the next canyon. And the Clark Canyon was also an old homestead, and it had the head of the Warm River on it. It came right out, a big spring came right out. It was at the bottom of Black Mountain. You could go up there a ways and get on the road and go up onto Black Mountain. There used to be a corral made out of poles at the bottom of Trail Canyon, and sometimes people that ranged sheep would put their sheep in there at night so they could be protected, I guess, that bears wouldn't come in and coyotes wouldn't come in and be able to bother them. They could keep them penned up at night. But later on, I don't remember anybody ever keeping sheep up in the woods. They kept them out on the flats and over west of the railroad tracks at Ripley Butte area, and up to Tom's Creek. But they didn't run sheep up in the woods on the east end of the flat after that I know of. I don't remember any other things happening with bears that summer. But in early winter that year, I was riding with Elmer Snowball. Elmer Snowball married my sister Thelma around Labor Day of that year. And in the summertime, the South ran a stream of water from Split Creek above Vanoy's down across the flat to the sawmill, so there was water there all the time for the steam engine. Then after the mill burned down there in the fall, they still had a ditch that ran water down to the camp, because Sister South used to have a garden, and she had a ditch that came down, and then that would go on out on the edge of camp into a borrow pit along the railroad tracks, and the water would flow up the borrow pit toward Tom's Creek. So there was water there, and in some places it ponded up somewhat, so there were cattails and other aquatic plants that grew in it. There's pollywogs and frogs and stuff in it all the time. And that went all the way up to Tom's Creek. Now, it took several days every spring when they turned the water into that ditch to get water in it, because the ground would be so dry it'd soak up the stream. Finally, after several days, it'd get the bottom of the stream filled enough that they'd get water to run down. And they come by the sawmill, and they had a little pond, right, or a big barrel or something next to the engine shed, and the water would go into that, and then they could get water out of that into the steam engine. And so at one time, along this stream in the camp, there were little footbridges, so you could cross over the ditch if you're walking back and forth from the sawmill to the camp. Anyway, when they built the new sawmill, they got a different steam engine, but just before the fire that burned down the sawmill, they had taken the old steam engine out and put the new steam engine in place. And I always remember that, because the night that it burned, I got to stay up all night, and we were up there, people carrying water from the ditch with buckets trying to put fire out. And I guess they were able to accomplish something. The sawmill itself, with the mill and the saw, didn't get burned. But it did burn up the engine shed, and it burned all of the bearings, soft bearings, out of the engine. And I can remember Barney spent a long time there Al helped him, and they had to build a fire, and they had a ladle made melt the solder, or babbitt they called it, which was used to make soft bearings. And they had to re-pour all the main bearings in that engine and get it to where they could get it started and run again. And then they drove it down. Arch Hess drove it, and they drove it down to the camp where they had the new sawmill set up. The cabin that Dad, Al, and I lived in was a slab cabin. It was quite a temporary type of building. And after a while before the mill burned down, because the weather's getting cold, and my mother would come up every day and cook meals on the majestic wood range that we had in the cabin. That's where she did her cooking. And she and Thelma and Anna lived in a small log cabin down at the camp that was near the railroad track and quite close to the south cabin where Barney and Marge lived. And so they moved that slab cabin down next to the cabin where my mother and the girls lived, so that in the cold weather my mother wouldn't have to go up to the other place to cook. And then it wasn't long after that the fire came along and we lost the sawmill. During the summer, my mother would walk up to the mill where we were, and she'd knead the bread, and she usually do that in the evenings. And then, of course, as it become fall weather and the days were shorter, when she'd walk up there to knead the bread, it'd be dark, it'd be nighttime. And one time, when she was walking up at night, she got up just past the barn, which was about halfway, and she could hear something walking to the side of her in the timber. She'd stop, and whatever it was, it'd stop. She'd start walking again, and it'd start walking, and she could hear it. So when she got fairly close to the cabin, she called out to my dad, and we were all in the cabin in bed, and he got up and went out, walked down toward the barn to meet her and to see what was going on, and then she came on up and kneaded the bread, whatever she needed to do, and then went home. And when she got ready to go back down, why, my dad was going to walk with her. That's kind of funny. Al and I, oh no, don't leave us here alone. There we were in the cabin and didn't have to worry about anything. But so he walked down part way, at least about to the barn, I guess, with her, and then she walked the rest of the way down to camp, and there was trees on both sides of the road till she got down to Wren's house, which is on the edge of the camp. And then that fall, one night, all of the men had left camp and gone to Pond's Lodge to get the mail and whatever, and my mother heard something out on the street walking on the road between her and the railroad crossing, which was 100 yards or so away from her cabin. And so she walked out on the porch and then out onto the road there, just 30 feet from her front door, I guess. And she had a little flashlight, and she could hear this walking on the road, something walking on the road and was walking towards her. She shined her flashlight out, and finally she could see in the circle of the flashlight light a bull moose, and it just kept walking and walking and walked right up toward her, and it was just right up almost in front of the cabin, and she backed up got on the steps of the cabin, and the moose was there in the circle of the light of the flashlight. And she called, and by then Thelma was married, and so she was living in the old bunkhouse, which was next to the south cabin, just a little ways from their kitchen door. And when Anna was over to Thelma's, they were visiting, and there's a young man working there that was interested in visiting with Anna. And so they came running to see what Mom was calling about. And when they ran over the footbridge, it made a noise, and the moose disappeared. And so by the time I got there, if Mom shined her light towards the railroad crossing, you could just see its eyes sparkle in the light. That's all you could see. You couldn't see the animal, but you could see its eyes in the light. And I remembered that. That fall, because the water didn't run down the ditch to the sawmill, of course, in the winter, when it's cold and there was ice, they would have frozen the ditch. Why, they had to haul water to the engine, and so Wren had a team of horses, they call it Old Dick and Old Clip, and Elmer hooked them up onto a sleigh, a bobsleigh, and on the sleigh was a water tank, the kind of tanks that the sheepmen used to haul water out to their sheep. I don't know how big a tank it was. It filled the bobsleigh, so it was probably 10 or 12 feet long and 4 feet in diameter. And he was going up one day to Tom's Creek to get water to bring back down, and he let me ride with him. And as we were going up the railroad tracks, along the edge of the railroad tracks was a road that went to Tom's Creek, and we saw some bear tracks in the snow. And so we supposed it was getting ready to hibernate someplace. I don't know just which year it was, but one summer after my father was working at the Ida Falls Temple, he had a 1936 Chevrolet, and when he'd come up to Island Park, he'd go up fishing on the Buffalo River. And there was one place where we always went. You'd have to cross Tom's Creek, and the bridge on Tom's Creek, they kept it repaired a little bit, and they put planks down for the tires so that the car wouldn't go through the old pole bridge. And then there was a wash in the Dugway, sort of steep hill that went up out of the creek, and it had a big wash on it, and you'd have to straddle the main wash with the tires. It took quite a bit of skill to drive the car up. For one thing, where these washes were on the hill, there was usually some large rocks, boulders, that were underneath the ground, and the tops of them would be exposed a little bit from the water running down the hill and washing, and so you'd have to be careful to get over those rocks okay without doing any damage to the bottom of the car. And then when we got up to the Buffalo River, there was a dugway down to a campground. It wasn't a campground that was kept up by the Forest Service or anything, just kind of a little clearing along the edge of the river, and people that went there to fish had just used it as a camping spot. I remember one time being there with my father and Al, and we slept out on the grassy spot there and next to where we could park the car, and it got kind of cold in the night, and I was sleeping in between them. If either one of them would roll over and so tightened the quilts and the blankets and quilts on top, then they'd stretch across tight between the two of them, and I was small enough that the covers didn't touch me. I remember I got pretty cold sometimes in the night because they'd turn over and stretch and pull the covers tight, and then I'd be down in below the covers. Anyway, one year I was up there with my father, and this was after he worked at the temple. And we were fishing, and we used to wait when we'd go to the Buffalo. We'd get off that little campground and go into the river, while you'd wait about just a little above your ankles for probably 30 feet or so before you got to the main channel of the river. And that was fairly shallow, and it wasn't so cold, it'd be kind of warm. Then you get out to the main channel, it'd be swift and cold. Anyway, I was fishing there, and my dad had been fishing upstream a ways, and he was fishing on his way back down, and the best fishing holes were up above us and below us. And as he came down, there was a little island about 100 yards from where we had our camp, and it wasn't a very big island, but it had quite a few small trees on it, and some of them were probably 20, 30 feet tall. And my dad came down, and he came to where I was, and he said, "There's a bear up there." And we didn't have any gun, so he was a little bit nervous about the bear, and so we started to clean the fish, and we kept watching up the stream, and then while we were looking, a young bear, probably a couple of years old, came out in the shallow along the edge of the main stream, and it went out and got up onto that island, and we could see it, and it went down along the island like it was sniffing his tracks where he'd walked, and it got down towards the end of the island toward us, and then it turned and went back up the island, and then it jumped off the island right into the deepest hole that was there, and crossed the river and went up onto the hillside on the other side. The hillside was fairly steep and rocky and tall trees on it, and went up there and just disappeared. There was another time when somebody went up there fishing. They had an old pickup truck, and so while they were off fishing, a bear came to that campground, and when they got back, they found a pair of boots that they'd had in the back of the pickup truck were out on the ground, and they could see they'd been chewed on a little bit. And of course, I guess they saw some bear tracks, and they knew that a bear had been there around the truck while they were away fishing. I don't know what year this was, but 1 year after I came home sometime after I came home from the Army, we were logging on the state section, which was up Trail Canyon. Part of it was on the north side, part of it was on the south side of Split Creek. Barney had leased this section from the state land. It was a state section. They used to have, they called school sections, and any revenue that came off of the school section would go to the state of Utah. All the other forest around belonged to the U.S. Forest Service. So by leasing this, he had full right to cut all the timber he wanted on the school section. They charged him a certain amount for what he cut, but they'd send a person out. The state had a forester hired that was in charge of their school section lands, and he'd come and inspect once in a while and check out how much they'd cut and what was going on. So anyway, partway up Trail Canyon, there was a place where Clark Canyon and Trail Canyon kind of came together, and at that place there was a grassy area, and it was quite green and wet, and at one time there'd been a well dug there, but there wasn't any well casing, and so there was just like a small little pond of water there. It was muddy and we didn't drink out of it, of course, but you could see from tracks that animals came there all the time. Elk and deer would come in there and get a drink, and so we were on our way up there. We used to keep the horses up at where we were logging, so sometimes we'd have to haul water to the horses. But when we were at this particular place, we just kept the horses there at a manger and take hay up to them. Then you'd go up in the daytime sometime and lead them over to the creek and let them get a drink. And this place on the creek, there used to be a cabin there. It's called Betty's Cabin. In Targhee Thai days, there was a woman there. That's where it's got its name, Betty, and she'd cook meals there. And Tyaks and people working in the industry there would come around where she was, and I guess she'd have meals for them. And also, one of the first times that the Burens came to Island Park, that was Ruth South's family before she's married. They went up to Betty's cabin. She had to go up there to stay overnight because there wasn't any place in the Thai camp where she could stay at night, so she went up and stayed. I think Betty's cabin probably had 2 rooms in it. Anyway, the night she was there was a bear came, and they heard the bear at the side of the cabin. They were quite nervous. People didn't believe them at first, but then later on somebody came up in the next day and looking around to see what the girls had complained about and found the bear tracks. Anyway, when the horses were kept near there, we just lead them down to the creek and they could drink. But when they were up on the hill where we logged, then we'd have to haul water to them each day. So we were going up to check the horses one time, and we were in a 46 Shiv that Barney had, and we had been up and watered the horses, and on our way back down to go to camp toward evening, and I think Steve was with us, Steve Knapp, Barry and David and I don't know which of the boys was driving, As we came down the road, we got near this old well or water hole. There's two little bears ran out on the road, and they were just running as fast as they could run, and they're kicking up dust with every jump they made. They went for 50 yards or so down the road and then ran off the road and into the timber out of sight, so we didn't see any more of them. In those days, we always figured if you're in Island Park out in the woods and you saw a bear, you're lucky, because bears are pretty alert, pretty hard to walk up onto a bear without they would know you were there, and they're afraid of you. So that's why we seldom ever saw them. But one other day we were going up to the woods. We're probably in the army truck. And we were driving up, Barry and David and I, and we got up a little ways above this well, just where the road goes up on top of a ridge where we went to log. And there's a bear, a good-sized bear, off the side of the road. And we stopped and looked at it. The bear looked at us and stood there, and just for a minute or so we just sat there and looked at the bear, and the bear didn't seem to be nervous at all. And somebody put their arm out the window of the cab and pounded on the side of the door of the cab a little bit to make a little noise. We thought maybe that'd scare the bear away. Didn't seem to bother it much, and finally it just kind of turned and walked off down through the trees. So we thought, well, that's a bear from Yellowstone Park, because if it had been a regular bear in that area, it would have been afraid, and we'd have probably never hardly seen it. So I remember that. There was a guy that used to haul slabs for Barney, and sometimes he'd get out cellar timber, and he'd go up Trail Canyon, up in the area where he logged, and get some dead timber and cut it out and take it down. And he had a little dog. He got it from Steve Knapp. It's just a little dog, some kind of a terrier. And he had that dog with him one day, and as he came along about this same place along Trail Canyon, he saw a bear, and there was a cub there. And he got out, and the little dog, of course, went running over barking, and the cub went up the tree. So he was quite excited about having that cub treat. And I don't know if he saw the old bear or not, but he couldn't stay there forever, so he finally decided, well, I guess better go home and maybe he could get a gun. But anyway, if he did go home and got a gun and came back, he never did see anything more of the bear. But the dog did tree the bear and keep the bear up the tree while they were there. One year, when Warren was working for Barney, and maybe Paul Walker was working that year for Barney, they'd go up to the logging area, start cutting trees, and I'd come up with the wagon, and we had old Nig and Bolly were the team we used. We'd catch the horses and harness them, and I'd start up, and they'd of course be ahead of me on the road with their logging truck. And so by the time I got up to where they were logging, ready to skid logs, it was probably about noon. And when I got up there, they said, well, they said they'd shot a bear. And they said what happened is they got up to the woods where they're going to cut, and they saw these cubs, and there was this bear where they turned the truck around, and the cubs went up a tree, I guess, and they were a little nervous about the old bear, but they said they couldn't hardly see her. She went off and hid behind a windfall, and they could, once in a while she'd raise her head enough they could see her, and she just stayed back out of sight. Seemed to be very frightened of the men. And so, but by the time I got there, the shooting was all over. I guess they shot her, and then they shot the cubs, and Warren had skinned them out, and Warren took the cubs home, and I'm not really sure there was two cubs. There might have just been one cub. But anyway, the old bear was old. Her teeth were all worn off bad. But when I got there with the horses, I drove the team up close to the wagon, or to the truck where they were. And when the horses smelled the hides of the bear, they got kind of excited about it. And so they told me, you'll have to be careful with the horses today, and be careful that they don't get excited and decide to run or something. And I remember that part of it. up on the Buffalo River, downstream from where we usually went to fish, the river was deeper, and there were lots of deeper fishing holes, and the river made a rather sharp bend, and from there it went all the way towards the highway in Pond's Lodge. And right on that bend, there was a nice summer home, and it belonged to some people from Pocatello, and they'd go up there every summer and spend time in their summer home, and then be there for a few weeks and fish, and then during the summer they'd probably make several trips up to the cabin. Right next to their cabin was a beautiful, nice spring that came out, flowed down a few hundred feet and emptied into the river, and they had cleaned all of the watercress and aquatic plants out so that the bottom of that stream was just clear, nice white sand, and it was a beautiful little clear stream of water. And then they'd build a little building right over the top of the spring. It's called a spring house, and in there they had shelves and things built. They could put a watermelon there, for example, or other things there, and it'd be a cooler, and it'd keep their food nice and cool. And this Mr. Wallens that had the cabin told us one time, every spring when they'd come up to go to their cabin the first time, they'd have to clear the road because the bears had come along in the spring after they'd come out of hibernation, and they'd tear the old logs they could find open to eat the grub worms. And so they used to have to go along. Plus, in the wintertime, there'd always be some trees that would tip over from the snow. A lot of these wouldn't have been big trees, but just trees that get too much snow on and they'd fall over. So they'd have to clear the road, cut the trees out of the way to get down to their cabin the first trip in. So they were familiar with bears and the problems they had with bears. Anyway, along this road down to their cabin, there was a bear trap. It had been built years before, during Targhee days probably. And this bear trap was made of good-sized logs. They're stacked on each other, probably notched a little bit on the end so they'd fit. And it was just big enough that a bear could go into it, but it wasn't big enough that the bear could turn around. And it had a top on it, so that it wasn't very tall, so the bear couldn't stand up in it. And at the opening where the bear could go in, there was a couple of logs probably. So say 2 logs high, that'd be maybe 15, 16 inches from the ground. And they said the reason it worked as a bear trap, if a bear went in there, it couldn't back out because it wouldn't back out and couldn't raise its hind legs and back up over the logs at the opening. And so it was there, and they said that's what it used to be used for. I've seen it, but I can't verify that it worked. I just heard the story about it. Well, just before you get to this bend where Wallen's cabin is, there's a place where the edge of the river is kind of like a little meadow or swamp, grassy and no trees. And there was a cabin built there. Some Tyhacks had probably built the cabin years ago, and they used it. And when I saw it, of course, the roof had caved in. It'd been there a long time, and in the wintertime, if you didn't get the snow shoveled off roofs, so they'd cave in, and that was the case here, that this roof had caved in. So during Targhee days, when my father was hauling ties, one time he hooked up his team on a wagon, and he and Warren went up there to fish, and they went to the Buffalo River, and they were fishing, and one of Dad's favorite horses they called Pungo. Pungo is also a sort of just a familiar name that people used sometimes for horses, like Fido used to be a common name for a dog. Anyway, this was a special horse, and so my father put a saddle on it. It had a harness on too, because it was pulling the wagon, but they put a saddle on it, and when they got up to where they're going to fish, he unhooked the horse from the wagon, tied the other horse up there, and then he took Claudia and Marge with him, and they put them on the horse, Pungo, and while they were fishing, the girls were riding the horse, and they'd ride him in the river and ride him up and down the river. The river's quite wide, it isn't real deep, And then on the sides, as I mentioned, it had a lot of water and aquatic plants, and the width of the river was much wider than the main stream. Anyway, they were fishing, and they heard the girls screaming and hollering, and looked, and this horse Pungo loved water, and he just laid right down in one of the holes there in the river and was soaking himself and soaked them good too. So Dad went down and got him out, got him up, and he took him into this old cabin at the edge of the river. And I guess he got some, I don't know if he got wood off the floor or if there's just some dead timber around there he could use. Anyway, he built a fire in the middle of this cabin. The girls hung their wet clothes up to dry, and Dad and Warren went ahead and fished for a while, and then later they come back and the girls' clothes was dry and they got dressed and hooked the wagon up, the horses to the wagon, and went back to Island Park. So that was one thing that happened there. Now, close to where this cabin was, there was a footbridge that the Tyaks had built, and this is what they did. They took round poles about 2.5, 3, 4 inches diameter, and they pounded them down into the sand in the bottom of the river, and they put them about a couple of feet apart, and then about every 15, 20 feet, they'd put 2 more of them, and then they fastened, I don't know how they fastened them, if they slashed it with wood or if they used nails or what, but they would put a cross piece of wood, a short pole or something, to connect the 2 staked posts together, and then they'd take 2 long poles and put them on these cross pieces so that they had a footbridge they could cross this river, walking on these 2 poles across the river that were supported by these stakes that were from one edge all the way across through the main channel and on over through the shallow water to the other side of the stream. And on the other side of the stream, they could go up into the timber, and up above that area was what was called the Moose Creek Plateau, and that's where a lot of timber had been cut. A lot of the logging was done up with it there. Anyway, on that side of the Buffalo River, the hill was steeper up, and there was a lot of timber there, and there was a lot of outcroppings of rocks. They were big rocks. They were kind of reddish in color. They weren't the rough lava rocks, but they were rocks that had been there forever, and the substrata, the ground and trees and other things grew up around them. One time, the story goes that a cutter there, a Tyack, was on his way to work one morning, and he's walking across this bridge. Now, they used a measuring pole, they called it, a measuring stick, and it was probably made of a jack pine that was about anywhere from an inch to an inch and a half in diameter, and it'd be 8 feet long, which is the length of the railroad tie. So he is crossing this footbridge. He got about halfway across the footbridge. Here he met a bear coming from the other side. Well, of course, they couldn't pass each other on the bridge, so when they finally got to each other, the bear didn't try to turn around and go back, and the Tyack took his measuring stick pole and he pushed the bear off of the bridge into the water. That's the story of that one. Now, the other story is at that same spot, near to where this cabin was.
How far of a drop was that bridge?
The bridge was just barely above the water. Say the water was a foot and a half deep, and the bridge was 8 inches above the water. Anyway, in this same area where this cabin was as I mentioned earlier, sort of a clearing, and there was a big old, from Dad's description, a big tough-looking old Tyack. His last name was Darrell, and Darrell had his tent set up in that area. He had a tent. And one day he came in for lunch or something and came back to his tent anyway. He opened the flap of his tent and went into the tent, and there was a bear in his tent. And the bear was so excited, it tore open a hole somehow and went out the back of the tent and escaped. They said that he was really a big, husky, strong guy, and the bear took off. I'd mentioned about the bears getting the grubs. Grub worms get in fallen trees, and after they've laid on the ground for several years, they get quite rotten, and they're not long, they're not solid, And one of the things that helps to get rid of these fallen trees is they're wood-boring insects. And in the larva stage, they eat their way through the trees that are down on the ground. And these we call grubs. Sometimes when people went fishing, they'd find a fallen tree like that, take an axe and start tearing it apart and pick up the grub worms in it. And then they could use them as bait on their hooks when they went out to fish. Now, these grub worms were about the size of a man's smallest finger. You could pick one up and hold it in your hand, and on one end it had pincers. They're like pincers. They looked about like. And if you take a dead pine needle, or if you took even a wood pick, if you even took a toothpick, you'd hold that, and when those little cutters would open up like a pair of snips, and you stick that toothpick in between there, they just cut that off. They just bite that off, just nothing. they could really cut. Sometimes if you go out by the sawmill where there's trees, logs on the skidways, you go out in the evening when it's cool and just quiet and listen, and you could hear them in the timber that was there on the skidway. You could hear them as they're chewing their way through the wood. It's kind of weird. Then, of course, when they hatch out, they're good-sized beetles. They're big beetles. Not far from this same cabin on the bend of the river, Wallen's cabin, where the hills go up kind of steep on the opposite side of the river, and where these outcroppings of rocks are, Pons, who had the Pons Lodge, used to fish a lot and hunt some, and they had discovered a cave in some rocks there near the edge of the river. So one year they went up there after the bears had hibernated, been in hibernation a while. They went up to one of these caves and they built a smudged fire. Now, a smudged fire is a fire you put in some green limbs with the green pine needles, and if you can get them to burn, they don't burn very easy, but they make lots and lots of smoke. So they started this fire at the opening of this cave, and the smoke would go into the cave, and so after a while, sure enough, a bear came out, and of course they shot it. And they shot it, and one of the reasons they did this in this time of year, after the bears have been in hibernation a while, they've no longer been rubbing on trees and itching and scratching, and so their coat is in prime condition. It's smooth, it's long, it doesn't have any spots on it where they've rubbed the hair. And they took this bear, which was a young bear, probably a year old or so, they took it down, had it mounted, and they had it in Pons Lodge on display in the dance hall for years. It was a nice-looking little black bear. At the head of the Buffalo River, there's a huge spring comes right out of the mountain. And above there, there's some steep hills covered with nice, tall lodgepole timber. And then just above the spring is kind of a lot of aquatic types of plants, and it's green, and it's just kind of like a little park. Well, back after Targhee Tie days, a fellow came there. His name is Ed Ryberg. He'd been in World War I, and he'd been severely injured by shell shock. And so he was from back in Minnesota or Michigan, someplace like that. I'm not really sure where, but anyway, we've got records of it because from the Idle Falls newspaper we have a record of when he died, and it tells about where he came from and what relatives he had. One day my father was fishing and he went up the Buffalo River as he used to do when he was hauling ties on Island Park, and there's a cabin on this spot. It was new then, and he talked to the fellow that was there, and it was Ed Ryberg. And Ed Ryberg said he was working to get gold. He said there's gold in that stream, and he was panning for gold and gonna get gold, and so he'd put into a mining claim, and he dug some holes up along the bank. Now, above this big spring, there's another stream that goes on up a canyon there a ways, and then at the top of that stream, there's another good-sized spring where a lot of water comes right out of the side of the mountain and into this stream, flows down. Has a lot of watercress in it. It's not a fishing stream. It has so much vegetation in it and rocks strewn in it. And then right where that spring comes out, there's a small stream runs into it, and this is called Chick Creek. And Chick Creek flows down for a mile or so from the south into this same spot. So when people talk about the head of the Buffalo River, sometimes they're talking about where the spring is, and sometimes they're talking about down where Ed Ryberg lived, where the big spring comes right out of the mountain. Anyway, I thought Ed Ryberg was probably the bravest man I ever knew. He had an old Model T that was a pickup truck, and he used to drive that. First time I ever saw him, that's what he was driving. And he came driving into the sawmill. He wanted to get a few boards of lumber. He came driving in that old rattle trap, we called them, and it made a lot of noise and vibration, and I remember it scared the old horse that I was skidding some logs or something with the horse, and the horse got all excited because of the noise of that old truck. Anyway, Ed Ryberg had gotten an engine up there, and he had it alongside of this stream above his cabin site, where he had a hole, and he was going to put a pump in there and pump water out of this hole he dug so he could get down to his mine shaft, he called it. Well, some people never did believe that he ever had intentions of getting gold and having a gold mine, but they thought he just did that as an excuse so he could be on the land, and they couldn't kick him off because he had a right to have a mining claim, and as long as he did a certain amount of work each year, well, he could stay on the claim, and so that's what a lot of people thought about him. Anyway, as I mentioned, I thought he's one of the bravest people I know, and I'll give you an example. He had to go to Pond's Lodge, which from downstream, if you went down the river from his place all the way to the highway to Pond's, it would at least be, I think, 5 or 6 miles. If you went along the road that he drove on, when he drove to Pond's, it would be probably 6 miles or 7. One time he needed a battery, and he went down to Pond's and bought a car battery. He put it in a gunny sack and put it over his shoulder, and he walked all the way home. And he walked up that road, all the way up that road to his cabin. And as you get up there in the timber, walking down a draw, and timber on both sides, you can hardly see any skyline. It's so dark. And I thought, he's brave to be able to do that in the middle of the night in the dark. And so I was talking to him one time, and he said, one time he went down from his cabin down the river a quarter of a mile or so, and he set out a bear trap. Sometime later, he's walking back through the timber to his cabin, and he came near that spot. There was a bear in the trap, and the bear was really angry. And when the bear saw him, it stood up on its hind legs. The trap was on a front leg. It stood up and it started pounding that trap against a tree. He said, I was scared. I ran all the way to my cabin and got my gun and went back and shot it. That's pretty amazing. I thought he was pretty brave. But he used to trap in the wintertime. He'd get on snowshoes and go from his cabin several miles away, and there were lots of old cabins around that had been left by Targhee, and he'd go to some of those old abandoned cabins, and that'd be his place where he might stay overnight there sometimes, and then he'd snowshoe along his trap line to the next place. And so he was quite a guy. He told us one time in the middle of the night he heard something, and he wondered what in the world it was. He had two rooms in his cabin, a back room and then the front room with his stove, and he kind of slipped back into the front room where the kitchen was, see what the racket was, and he said there was a cow moose on his porch. And he said, I was really scared. Now I'm going to tell you a story. I told this, and I told it wrong. I told it, and then I talked to Majine one day recently about it, and she straightened me out on it. So I'll tell it with her version, which is the eyewitness one. One fall, Marjorie took her family. And I didn't know Magina was there at the time. I thought she was maybe on her mission, but she was there. So they all got in the Volkswagen Bug. They went to Old Faithful, and they had 2 sleeping bags. They took the sleeping bags, and they found a spot that was kind of grassy across from a service station in Old Faithful. They laid their sleeping bags out there, and Susan and Randy got in one of the sleeping bags. Myrna, Magina, and Marge got in the other sleeping bag, and they slept there overnight. In the middle of the night, sometime in the middle of the night, why, Magina woke up, and she looked up, and there's a bear standing. His head was just inches away from Marge's head in the sleeping bag, and she wanted to let Marge know, but she didn't want to talk out loud and make noise. So she tried to get Myrna, who was sleeping next to her, to tell Marge, and she couldn't get Myrna awake enough to give the message. So before she could get a message to Marge, the bear moved and was gone. So in the morning she told them about it, and they didn't believe her. Well, it snowed a skiff of snow that night. So when they got out of their sleeping bags, there's the bear tracks. The bear had been right there by Marge's head. Then it wandered off across the road afterwards. So that was quite exciting for her to be laying there awake and the bear there, and she didn't dare scream or holler. There was a man from near Rexburg. He lived in Independence, just a ways out of town. That was a ward in the area that was known in early days. There were several such places near Rexburg, like Hibbard, where my father was raised. He ran sheep, and he ran them in Island Park. He had leases from the BLM, I guess, and the Forest Service mainly. And he ran his sheep down on the west side of the railroad tracks at Island Park, down around Ripley Butte, all the way to Last Chance, and then in the Island Park area up to the Tom's Creek. And he had these herds of sheep, and he had a herd of sheep every summer. He'd bring it over there. Now, over around DuBois and over west of Island Park, he had property, and he had places over there where he'd take his sheep in the earlier spring and in the fall, and then he had property out there. He had a section of ground where he kept his horses during the winter to winter them. Well, he had a sheep herder, an old man from down in, I think, North Carolina, maybe South Carolina, and this man and his wife every summer would come and tend the sheep when they were in this Island Park area. His last name was Miller, and he was a good old guy. He'd come by, they'd come on their saddle horses sometimes and come over and visit with Souths and with us, the rest of us there at the sawmill and visit. He's interesting to talk to. And as they'd moved, they had a sheep camp, and they lived in the sheep camp, and the Forest Service regulations were such they could only stay in one campsite for 3 days and then have to move to another place. So he had these campsites all through the area where he'd have some poles set up where they'd tie the horses at night and different things, and put up shelters. And then they had a water tank they sometimes took along in case they had to get water for their sheep, or they'd go to a stream someplace and get water and haul the water to the sheep. Anyway, he was a good old guy. I remember one of the first times I ever met him, he's visiting with us, and when Barry was a small boy, say he was second grade or something like that, and we went to visit Miller's and visit and talk, and he said he called Barry a cotton top because Barry was blonde. And so when he's a cotton top, and he always called him a cotton top when he was little. He and his wife had some experiences with bears there, and one time he was having a bear kept getting in, killing some of his sheep, so he talked to my brother Warren, and Warren had a bear trap, so Warren went over and they put some dead poles up, fastened them up, and leaned them up against a tree, and in a way that it made a V from the tree out. The poles were laid in a V shape, and then they put the bait, which was probably some remains of a dead sheep or something, back in the corner by a big tree where they fastened all these other poles and trees. So the bear would have to go into this V and go up in toward the corner to get to where the trap was. And they did catch a bear in this trap one time. And I remember when Warren went out and checked the trap and there's a bear in it, he handed the rifle to his daughter Maureen. She was just a young teenager at the time, and maybe 12 years old or so. And so she got a chance to shoot the bear close range. Is in a trap and she gets shot at. Anyway, that's what happened to that. But one time Peterson and his wife were out, and I don't know exactly what happened. That there was a pair of I guess his sheepdogs. His sheepdogs chased a bear, and there were two cubs, and the two cubs got frightened. And the way they think happened later was that these two cub bears ran to Mrs. Miller for protection from the dogs, and it just scared the poor woman so bad she about had a nervous breakdown from it. But these two cub bears are running up to her because the dogs are chasing them, and she didn't know what to do. Screamed and yelled, and I guess he came along and scared them off. So that was quite an experience for them. And so now I'm going to change over to some other things. I'm going to tell you, my brother Warren used to trap bears. He decided to trap bears, and he'd go to the garbage pit, which was up close to the Elk Creek Ranch. That Elk Creek Ranch belonged to the Zollingers, and it was just not too far from Pond's Lodge. And it was a dude ranch, basically, and they had strings of dude horses there. They'd take people and dudes out on rides, and he used to go there, and sometimes he'd set his trap, sometimes he'd just go there late at night and use the spotlight on his car, expecting bears to come in and get into the garbage. And I was with him one time, and I went with him, and we went out. He'd set his bear trap. Earlier, he'd been there with his spotlight, and he saw a bear, and he shot the bear, and the bear ran off. So we were here this night, and there's a bear in the trap. And so he's got his spotlight on his car, and he's shining the spotlight around. And here's this bear, and the bear's caught by a hind leg. And the bear stood up on, and not only then, but later we were able to see, the bear had almost stripped all the bark off of that tree as high as it could reach. Of course, it limited how high it went because the trap was fastened at the base of the tree. But that bear was enraged, and we watched it, and it reached over and picked up a quaking-ass log tree that was there, a windfall. And that tree was probably 4 or 5 inches in diameter, at least. It picked that up in its mouth and waved it around just like a dog would wave a stick. And that's the first time I realized, I guess, how powerful a bear was, So anyway, he shot it, and after he took it out of the trap, on one side of the bear, there was a spot there, say 2 inches in diameter, 2.5, where there wasn't any hair. And the bear had been licking the spot, apparently, because it was just slick and clean looking. All you could see is just the hide. And Warren said, well, he'd read one time that if you shoot a bear at an angle, if you had it, the bullet hits at a certain angle, the bullet will just wind in the hair and won't penetrate the skin. He said, well, this is the bear I shot that ran off. He said it just took a spot of that hair and hide, and the bullet kept going and the bear ran off. So he thought it was the same bear he probably caught. Now, on the way to Ponds, there's a little sagebrush flat, and out of that flat there's a road that goes to Simmons Ranch. And so Warren set his trap under a big tree, and up 7 or 8 feet in the air there's a limb, a good-sized limb, and he tied a bucket to that limb with fish heads in it. They'd cleaned some fish, and they just put fish heads in for bait. So the fish heads would have been pretty ripe and a pretty strong smell, and he hung it up there and put the bear trap right below it. And he figured, well, the bear would come along and smell those fish heads, and when it went to get up to get them, it'd probably step in the trap. Well, we went back one day, and the trap had been set off. But when he looked close at the trap, there were some long hairs in the trap, and there were 2 big footprints in the ground by the trap. And he theorized the bear got up to get those fish, got the bucket, and was going to sit down to eat them. And and sat in the trap instead of stepping in it. So the big footprints of the bear got out of that trap. Now, in olden times back whenever, some of the people used to take, they called them pickle barrels. They were wooden barrels. They were used to get, if you used to order nails, in a big supply of nails, they'd come in a barrel. And you knock the end out of the barrel and then just take the nails out as you used them anyway. Somebody had taken one of these barrels and taken the end out of one end and then driven spikes in at an angle. And then they put fish heads or whatever bait was stinky and they thought would draw a bear down in the bottom of that barrel. Then the bear would come along and stick its head down in there to get the bait, and those spikes all driven in at an angle, he couldn't get his head back out. And so some of them claimed they caught bears by using that method. So anyway, Warren tried that several times, never was quite fortunate. Now somebody said, well, fasten the barrel, and they said, well, no, if you fasten the barrel, then the bear will pull hard enough to get it out. So then they know one time of a bear that probably got in that trap and went running through the trees and ran into a tree and busted the barrel, got loose that way. So Warren got about the same size barrel that was metal, and he got some big spikes and got them heated with a torch and bent them so that they all went into the trap at an angle, and baited it and put it around, and never ever got a bear in one of those traps. He set it lots of different places. He took it to a place down in Ripley Butte where there were bear tracks everywhere around a kind of a little spring that just came up out of the ground where animals went to drink. He never ever caught a bear in that trap. But anyway, he just kept trapping, and we went up to Howard Springs above Henry's Lake, almost to the Continental Divide on the way to West Yellowstone. Sat for hours and hours in there with a spotlight waiting to see a bear. Finally saw some motion, turned on his spotlight, and it was a porcupine running around the parking lot. It was a campsite, actually, and we were there in the fall when there weren't tourists camping. And then he went down to an inn at the edge of Henry's Lake, got permission from a man that ran the inn to put his bear trap up at his garbage pit on his private property up above his inn. And he said, it's okay be careful, because I have a boy that sometimes goes hunting and trapping around on my property. I don't want him to get in the trap. So Warren said, oh, I won't leave it there all night. So we set this trap just before dark, went back a little while later, and we went up and thought, well, nothing's happened, we'll walk up there. We got up to where the trap was, and the bait was gone. So we knew that the bear had been there and was around there somewhere. But we didn't stay long. We got the trap and went back to the car and left. Never went back there again trapping, but it was kind of spooky knowing that there was a bear right there someplace by us. And then one time, my dad and Al and Warren and I all get in my dad's old 41 DeSoto and drove over to the garbage dump. This was the new garbage dump that had been moved across the highway from where the old one was. And they dug this dump. It was quite fresh, and so on one side of the pit was all of the dirt they'd piled up. So there's a pile of dirt there 4 feet high or so. So we pulled in and drove along the edge of the garbage dump and sat there in the dark and waited and waited and waited. And finally we could hear some tin cans rattling, and we knew something was down in the pit. And we watched and watched, and finally the bear came up out of the pit and was up on top of this bank of sand. Now the pit was 30, 40, 50 feet long maybe, and this 4-foot bank of dirt on top of it. Turned on the spotlight, and there's the bear right there. And so guns were stuck out the window. There was Al and Warren and my dad all had guns. They all shot about the same time, I think. That bear, it is amazing to me. As soon as that bear was hit, it swung its head around to the side where it got hit by its heart, I guess, and grabbed at it. It grabbed it wherever the bullet went in. And then it just began to roar like a lion. And it jumped in the air, and it reminded me of these cartoons where an animal jumps in the air, and when it comes down, it's running full speed. That thing jumped in the air, and it landed. It was going as fast as it could run. Ran to the end of the pile of dirt, turned around, ran back the other way as fast as it could run, turned around and ran again, and then dropped over. My word, that thing, what a noise and what a racket. And then you think about it. If that bear had been shot in the heart like it was out someplace and it decided it was going to get you, it could get a lot of ground between you and it covered before it died. Now, another time at the pit, Dad and I were there, and we sat and waited quite a long time, and the bear came up out of the pit. Dad turned on his spotlight, and there's the bear, just right there. His windows down, he stuck his rifle out. He shot the bear, and he hit the bear right at the base of its ear. And it just dropped, like Dad said, it dropped like a beef. Just dropped right flat to the ground. But it was on that pile of dirt, and its weight was such that it slid off over the edge to the opposite side, so it was out of sight. We couldn't see it. So we were pretty cautious. We drove down to the other end of the garbage pit and shined the spotlight up there, and we couldn't see any motion or anything. Finally, we drove around behind, and we backed up to the bear, and we're going to load it in the back of the trunk of his car. This 41 DeSoto had a club coupe, and so it had quite a large trunk. We couldn't get the bear into the trunk. So we drove home, and we got a guy that worked for Barney, Moyne Jensen was his name. Got him out of bed, because this was late at night, about midnight. Drove back over and got him to help us, and we laid some poles down and rolled the bear up the poles into the trunk of the car. Took it home and gave it to Warren. Warren got to where he really liked bear meat. After the time that they got the bear up in the woods when they shot this old mother bear with cubs, Warren said, "Oh, that's just as tender and nice as chicken." And after that, now I'm going to tell you something I admit to. I went to see Warren one time, and he was cooking supper, and he had some bear liver that he cooked. Well, I never did care much for liver. We used to have liver sometimes, but you could buy it at the meat market. But I never liked liver. I never did like liver. Of course, I was his guest, and I ate liver. I thought that was really good. I never ate any liver any other time, but I thought that was really good. Anyway, so much for that. So Warren used to like to eat. He told my dad one time, he said, if somebody shoots a nice elk, or if I shoot a nice elk and somebody shoots a bear, I'll trade him the elk for the bear. He said, that's really the best meat. So one time, some guys got in touch with Warren, and they said, we have a bear. We'd like you to take it if you want to skin it. And Warren said, sure, I'd like to. So they told us a story. They were down below Island Park someplace, and they set a trap for a bear, and they caught this bear by a hind leg. And when they went back there, she had a cub. So they scared the cub up a tree, and they wanted to catch the cub alive. They thought, if we shoot this bear, the cub will probably run off, so we'll leave her alive while we catch the cub. So that's what they did, and then later they brought the bear to Warren, and he skinned it. And I remember when he skinned it, he hung it up on just like you'd hang up an elk or a deer, he hung it up in a tree, dressed it out. And you've heard people say that bears look like humans when they're dressed. They have a strong resemblance, except I've never seen, of course, a human that's so muscular. Big, strong, heavy muscles all around the shoulders and the upper arms and everything. But Warren said those guys are so foolish. That bear had struggled and jerked and jumped and pulled against that trap that was chained to a tree so hard that it pulled its hind leg joint out. Its joint was disconnected from it, pulling so hard on that trap to get loose. He said they're lucky she didn't get loose. Of course, she'd had to have torn all her hide loose too to get loose from the trap, but unless she could have somehow got it off. Anyway, that's how hard she struggled to try to get loose. So I've always remembered that. Now, I'm going to tell you another story about a bear. This miller that was running sheep there was down in Ripley Butte. We were logging down there, logging fir, and he told us one time, he said his dogs were chasing a bear, and he finally got to where he got a shot at it. He hit it, and it ran off, and he followed his dogs. The dogs followed the bear. And just a little ways off of our logging road, there's an outcropping of lava. Well, they followed this bear, and the bear went to this outcropping, and it dove into a hole that went down quite far. So he told us about it, and everybody's excited at camp. And at that time, there's a guy working for Gene Jones. He had his own truck and hauled ties from the sawmill up in the woods. His name was Luke Lim. He was about the same age as Burdett, and he was tall like Burdett, except he was slender. He and Burdett used to have foot races all the time. Burdett always outran him, but he always come back for more. When they used to play a game called chicken, you go down the road, two cars coming toward each other, and they'd see who'd be the last one that'd finally swerve and get out of the way so they didn't wreck. He was a daredevil playing that game. I was never involved in the game, but I know he tried it on Burdett and a few others a few times. Of course, they always got off the road and let him go, but he's a daredevil. Anyway, we went down then to see the bear. We went down, and the guys pulled the bear up out of that hole, and I feel kind of ashamed sometimes to tell this story, but we pulled it up, and then they cut the head off. Then they got a short pole or limb, and they stuck it up the windpipe into the head, and we took the head back to camp. So then we take the bear head after dark and take it up by somebody's tent or tent frame or the cabin and scratch on the side of the building with a stick. Somebody'd come to the window and peek out the window, and see that bear head. And we thought we were going to really scare them. The first one we tried, the guys, okay, what's going on out there? What is it? His voice was a little bit shaky. He's an older gentleman. And then we tried it on another one or two. And so then they decided, well, you'd take it up to the boss's cabin. We went up to the boss's cabin, and they were up late, some of them sitting, visiting. It wasn't that late at night, actually. And I said, well, take it up and hold it in front of the kitchen window. So we decided, well, outside the kitchen window, about 25 feet or so away, was an outhouse. And we knew Gene Jones lived there, his wife and Glenna, that's Rand's daughter. And this Luke knew that inside the cabin, over the door, kitchen door, Gene had his rifle. So he went into the house and stood by the door just in case Gene come running and grabbed that rifle. None of us to get shot. They held that bear head up to the kitchen window and scratched on the side of the cabin. Sure enough, it caused a commotion. People were jumping all over. And what we didn't know then, and they didn't know, they had a girl probably 5 or 6, 7 years old, and she'd gone out to the outhouse, and they didn't know she'd come back in the house yet. So they thought, oh no, she's out there, and so boy, they were excited. So Burdett, Luke and I guess thought that was so much fun why we decided we'd have to go up to the upper camp up on the Split Creek, which is about an 8-mile drive. So we drove up there and got up there around midnight. We turned our lights out at the top of a dugway. There's a dugway goes down to the camp on the stream. And we stayed up there and waited. And there was there was a guy working there. He and his wife had been there just a month or so. And they had come in a old school bus. So they were in this school bus, and the lights were on in the school bus. Turned out they'd been playing cards that night. And some of the other guys had been over there, and they'd all been together playing cards. So we had to wait it out. We didn't dare drive down the dugway, because they'd hear us coming, and we didn't want to be a surprise. So we stayed up there, and to me there was something happened unusual and spooky. There was a noise came up from down in the canyon where the Split Creek is. That was strange to me. I never heard it before or since. And it just seemed like it was a kind of a mourning call, like something was lost, trying to find its mate or its mother or whatever. And it just kept, every once in a while, you'd hear that mournful call coming up out of the canyon. Nowadays, I never heard of Bigfoot back in those days. Nowadays, we might have wondered if it was Bigfoot. But anyway, so we finally, the lights went out with this school bus. So we take the bear head and we go down, walk all the way down the dugway. It's 200-300 yards into the camp, and we go over by the school bus. Nothing happened at the school bus much. So they went to this one cabin, and Burdett's friend Jim Taylor was in that cabin. And we went around the cabin, and there's a window on one side, and the door was open ajar, just a little bit open. We went around the side, held the bear head up near the window and scratched on the side, and we thought there's enough moonlight maybe to look out and see the head. And everything was quiet, so quiet, no noise. And then all of a sudden we heard the door slam shut. And then, of course, we all started to laugh. Oh, that was funny. And Jim was in there, and he had a cat, a kitten. He had it in his arms. He was standing there, and he was nervous. He got over and slammed that door. So then after we laughed, and he found out who we were, and we got together. Then he wanted to be involved, too, a little bit, so we went to a tent frame. A tent frame is where there's some wooden lumber up 3 or 4 feet high, and then a tent over the top of it. So we went to this tent frame, and we pulled the flap open just a little bit, and I held one ear of the bear, and Luke held the other ear of the bear, and we held it up just inside of that tent flap, and we scratched on the side of the tent. What is it? Who's there? Who's there? And then the guy was inside, it turned out, was sleeping on his back in his sleeping bag. He turns on his flashlight, and there's this bear head. Now, I had taken some barbed wire and lifted the lips up on the side of the bear's mouth and stuck the wire into the gums so that the lips were up out of the way so you could see the teeth. So that's what he saw. He looked up, and there's this bear's head open with the teeth showing. Oh, my gosh. He let us scream. You could probably heard a mile away. And then after that, just laughter. Oh, boy. Luke just jumped up and down on the ground and laughed and thought it was so funny. And then Charlie Whiting lived in the tent next to that one, come out, saw the commotion, what's going on. And he said, you guys are lucky. You're lucky he didn't shoot you. I remember Luke said he was too scared to do anything. But anyway, the sad part, and I feel bad about it, I'd never do that again myself. The next day, the guy checked out and left. Never came back to work. Oh, that's terrible. Terrible to do that to somebody. Seems like. Well, I can't remember what year it was. It was maybe 1971 or something like that. Keith and Irma's Louise's oldest sister, lived down in Sterling near Manti, and one day a fellow down named Christensen wanted somebody to help drive a truck to northern British Columbia to haul some cattle, and he wanted Keith to go, and Keith said, well, I can't very well go. So they got a hold of me, and got a hold of Jim, and Jim and I decided we'd go. So I met the guy and got in the truck. The guy they sent was this guy's nephew. He was Dave Olson, and his uncle was Keith and Irma's bishop. And so we drove that truck all the way up through Montana and into a place in Alberta. We were quite amused at all the rigmarole to get across the border. They want to know what we're doing and why we're there, and said you can't come in Canada and work. You can't work in Canada. Anyway, they had all this stuff they quizzed us on, and finally went through, and we went to a place called 40 Feeders. It's a big feeding lot. Well, what had happened? They'd had this truck up there with a pup trailer on it, and both of them had stock racks, and they were hauling a load of cattle up to northern BC when they had a serious problem with the truck. So they couldn't get it fixed there, so they ended up taking it back to Salt Lake, to a shop in Salt Lake where they fixed whatever was wrong with it, and we went back. So we went to 40 Feeders. What happened is when they had their problem with the truck, it was loaded with cattle, so they left the cattle at 40 Feeders, and then later, of course, had to pay for the days that the cattle were there and they were feeding them. So we went there to pick up the cattle, and we got them loaded and started on up, and it took us quite a while to get there. We stayed one night at a place near there called Raymond, Canada, and then went on up to this 40 Feeders, loaded the cattle, went on up, and it was a long road. A sensation I felt when we traveled up there was like you're going to the top of the world. It just seemed like it, as that highway went on and on and on and on. Once in a while you'd go way down, cross a stream, go way up the other side and on again, because those streams were way down below the level of the ground. So we went all the way up. We got to out of Alberta, went into British Columbia. There's a lot of beautiful country there. Red Deer in Alberta is a pretty place. Big, beautiful farms and barns, and a lot of them look like they're just carved out of the timber. You see a straight line of trees all along the edge of a nice field full of alfalfa and different things. Corn, well, not corn so much. The only corn up there we saw was at Peace River, down on the level of the river, which is way down from above. They said people raised corn, but the climate was too short otherwise. And a lot of years their wheat would freeze out. But a lot of people went up there and bought out old homesteads. A lot of people from Utah and Idaho and places go up there and buy these old homesteads because it was cheap ground compared to what you paid in the States for acres. Anyway, we finally got up there and got the cattle loaded, and we hauled them on up to the ranch. The ranch was on a place called Cache Creek. Cache Creek was about 40 miles up the Alcan Highway. The Alcan Highway starts at just after you get into BC a little ways, and it's paved for quite a ways. Probably the first 50 miles is paved, and then it's gravel after that. Anyway, we got out to this Cache Creek, unloaded the cattle there at the ranch, and there was a guy at the ranch, D. Jones, and his wife and kids lived there, and turned the cattle out in the pasture. The next morning, Jim and one of their boys, I think Mike, went down to check on the cattle. They went down to check on the cattle, and they saw a couple of bears, and the bears were reared up on their hind legs looking over the fence at the cows. And they thought that was strange. Anyway, they ended up that they shot Mike and Jim shot one of the bears, I guess. So they got that back to the ranch and skinned it out. Well, then they didn't have a ward there. They had a branch in Fort St. John's. And D. Jones was like a high councilman, except it wasn't a stake yet, so he was whatever it would have been. And so he was called away to go to a different branch and talk on Sunday. So we came home from church on Sunday and didn't have much to do and just around the house. In the afternoon, I walked out and walked down to the barn. There weren't any cows in the barn or anything. There's just the barn and some corrals around the barn. And I climbed up 2 or 3 poles on the barn and leaning there, looking down over across the creek. Now again, the creeks are worn down so that the water is 20, 30 feet sometimes lower than the ground around it. And I was sitting there or standing on this corral fence looking out there, and I saw something a little ways away at the edge of a field. The field probably had oats, and I looked at it a little bit, and I thought it was probably a neighbor's dog. And all of a sudden it dawned on me, that's a wolf. It was pitch black. It was black. There's that big wolf standing there. So I slipped down off the fence careful, and I kind of hurried back up toward the house. When I got up almost to the house, to the lawn, why, their dog there at the ranch barked at me. And I turned my head and looked. When that dog barked, that wolf jumped in the air, just jumped in the air, and then it ran off. My word. So I went in and told Sister Jones, I said, can I take the rifle, go back down? And she says, no, I don't think we should on Sunday. And so I didn't. But D. Jones had a 30-06 there in his house. So anyway, Jones came home later, and I told him about it, and he said, oh, yeah, you should have gone down and see if you should. He said, I don't like to have wolves around this close to where my kids are. So anyway, up there, why, in the nighttime, there's a mist comes, and you look out, and it's just like it's fog. But as the sun comes up, that kind of gradually lifts and goes up and disappears. So I couldn't sleep well, and did give me permission. So the next morning when I woke up, and it's early, it's like 3 o'clock in the morning while it's starting to get daylight, because they have such short night times. So I got that rifle, and I went walking on down, and I was going to go down and see if I'd see that wolf. And I got down past the trail a little ways on the hillside looking down there. And by the way, we had gone down later, Jim and I and Mike, and seen tracks in the mud on the edge of the little creek there of this wolf. It was big wolf tracks. Anyway, I went down there and I stayed there a while and watched. And it's pretty cool in the morning. It's quite cool weather. It got a little bit cold, and then I saw something black. And I saw it cross the stream, and it came on my side of the stream into the trees. I stayed there a while, but finally I got a little nervous because I didn't know how far up the trees it might have come. So I started backing up, and I went back, and there was a bunkhouse there. It wasn't used, it was empty, but there was a bunkhouse, had a porch on it. So I backed up onto this porch, and I stood there and waited and watched. And off to the left of me was a field with alfalfa, and they'd baled the hay on it, so there are bales of hay out there. I looked over there, and there's a bear by one of the bales of hay. So I had to take about 2 steps to get to the corner post of the porch of the cabin in order to have a rest to take a shot. I took those 2 steps, and that bear reared up on its hind legs and looked at me, and I thought, my word, it couldn't have hurt me. I was amazed that it would have spotted me that. So anyway, I got a dead rest on that, and I took a shot. Nothing happened. And bang, bang, I took another shot, just as fast as I could reload it. It's a bolt action. Took another shot, and down went the bear. So then I watched a little while, didn't say anything, and then I walked back up to the cabin, and Mike and Jim were awake. They'd heard the shot and were awake. What are you shooting at? What were you doing? I said, I shot a bear. Oh, no, you didn't shoot a bear, Mike said. You didn't shoot any bear. And I said, well, come with me and I'll show you. So we walked down, and sure enough, walked down past that bale of hay, and there's this, about a yearling bear, I guess, laying there. So we took it and dressed it. Sister Jones had some bear steak for us that day. Tasted really good. So anyway, that was interesting. So after they'd shot the first bear, and then I shot this bear, we went over to a ranch one day not far from there, and along the way we saw 3 or 4 bears. One of them ran across the road in front of the car or truck, and another one we saw, and the guy had a beehive, some beehives at the ranch we went to, and he'd put up an electric fence around it because the bears kept getting into it. And we looked upon the hillside, and sure enough, there's a bear sitting up there, a big old brown bear up on the hillside. So then we went past a barn, and we saw a bear kind of going quiet, sneaking along, went past the barn up near somebody's house. He thought, that's strange. So we went on by, and then we went to another place, and we saw a bear cross the road in front of us. So they each had rifles, so they said to me, you drive. And so I drove up to where the bear had crossed the road. And I stopped. I had rear view mirrors. I could see behind me. I could see ahead of me. There wasn't any traffic. It's just this road out to this guy's ranch. But it was a graded road. It was a nice road that way. Anyway, I sat there and watched. And finally they saw a bear. And they shot at it. And then they didn't see it again. So they went walking out. It was in a little clump of aspens. They went walking out there looking around. And finally, Mike says, here's some blood. So they start trailing the little trail of blood, and only about 50 feet behind the truck, the bear crossed the road right behind where I was sitting there with the rear view mirrors and watching. I didn't see it cross the road. It just like a phantom. So then we turned the truck around, and then we went down and followed the tracks a ways and went into some timber. We went into the timber a little ways, and we're going down through the timber, and Jim said, I think that's it. And it raised up and looked over a fallen log or something, and they shot it. But it was an old bear. Some of its teeth were broken off. And we wondered if it was the same bear we'd seen when we were there before by this people's ranch. Anyway, we took that bear home, but we didn't do anything with, or maybe we did. Maybe Jim got that hide. And then we took the 2 hides, the hide that I'd got at the ranch and this brown bear hide that Jim shot. And D. Jones built a thing out of wood, some pieces of inch lumber, and made a box in the bottom of the frame of the truck. And he put those up under that. And so when we came back to Utah, we brought those with us. And I thought a lot of times, it's interesting. Somebody didn't have a dog.
Where do you want this?
Just any place.
Do you want it in the shop?
Whatever. So, yeah, that'd be fine. So then we brought him back to Utah, took him to a taxidermist or someplace in Draper where they tanned the hides for us. And I don't know where mine is today, and Jim doesn't know where his is.
Well, yours has been in this house.
Let me tell you a little story about Jim's bear rug. He brought it to Provo one time, and just over a little ways from us by Faulkner's, across the street from Faulkner's, where nowadays belongs to Steve Young, there was a little house along the railroad tracks. 2 girls lived there that were in our ward, and so Jim took the bear hide over there one day and was going to scare them, so he took it up by their front door and knocked or something, and they had a dog, and the dog got a sniff of the bear, I guess, and went pretty crazy and barking and run all around. The girls didn't admit it at first, but later they said they were nervous, but they didn't really have much happen. But anyway, he did have that much fun with it, taking it up and trying to scare them, I guess. So much for bears. I can't think of any more stories I haven't already told about bears, and so I guess I'll finish this section, and someday I'll talk about some other things. I want to make a tape about horses sometime. I do have some more stories. The year Louise and I got married, and we went up to Island Park, we went to West Yellowstone, and Steve Knapp lived in West Yellowstone. He worked for the power company up there. Warren came up one time while we were there. I think Beth was with him, and we went out to the West Yellowstone garbage dump. Had signs and marked where it was. We went on out of town going west. I don't know if we crossed the river and went on out, or if it was before you crossed the river, but we went out there a mile or so, or a half mile at least, and then there was this garbage dump, and the dump was down at the bottom of a hill, or there was a ravine down below, quite a ways below us. We went out there, and Warren had his spotlight, shined it around, and we sat there a while and waited, and sure enough, after a while, here's a big grizzly bear. She's there with her cubs, and her head looked as big as a basket you'd have for corn or potatoes or something. And she was right there feeding right in front of us. And the cubs were down over the hill down below, and if you went over, he had a portable spotlight. If you went over to the edge of the hill and looked down over, the cubs were down there playing and fighting each other a little bit, wrestling around. So that was kind of interesting. And then we went back a couple of times. One time we went back, and there was a Volkswagen van bus parked there, had a California license on it, and they were photographing, and some of the photographs they took from that van ended up in the National Geographic magazine. There's grizzly bears feeding there. Anyway, that happened. And then one time, Barry and I left Island Park and went up to West Yellowstone and drove out to that bear pit. We sat quite a long time waiting to see something. Finally, a bear came in, and that was a strange bear. We both noticed it. It came kind of sneaking in. It was a fairly good-sized bear, but it came sneaking in quietly, rummaged through stuff a little bit, and then finally left. But it was a strange bear, and we decided maybe there's a chance that that bear was half grizzly and half brown bear, and so it wasn't associating with the other bears very well, and that's why it seems so strange and why it snuck around. Anyway, that was interesting that we saw that bear and how different it was from all the other bears we saw there at the pit. Then we heard that later on some tourists went out there and shot a bear, and so the state closed it down so people couldn't go there at night and see the bears anymore. So that was the end of the garbage dump experience in West Yellowstone. Willis can remember when we had a bear hide here in our house, someplace in our basement last time I ever saw it, but I don't know where it is now. I can't find it, and that's happened with several things. There's several things I haven't been able to find. I did find my moose hide and a couple of elk hides that are tanned downstairs, but I haven't ever found the bear hide, but it must be down there someplace. I want to add something. First of all, let me say this. Up Trail Canyon, there's a ridge between Trail Canyon and Split Creek. One time, I don't know just how old Barry would have been. I don't know if it was before his mission or after his mission. But Barry and David at one time got bows and arrows. And of course, they're just target arrows. But Barry went up and was on that ridge up Trail Canyon, walking along, and looked up, and there's a full-grown bear up there ahead of him. And he looked at it, and it didn't bother him, and he didn't bother it, and he just stood there and looked at each other, and Barry took an arrow and shot at the bear, and the arrow just missed the bear went over its back and went into a tree that was right there behind the bear. The bear just turned its head toward him and growled and then walked off. So there's, show you how brave Barry was. Now, the other thing I want to tell you about is, I've told this, and this is my opinion. When Warren was catching bears once in a while and skinning them out, he skinned out the head of one of the bears, so it just had the skull. And he pointed this out to me. He said, if you were to shoot at a bear and it was facing you and you thought you'd shoot it between the eyes, you can see by the way the skull's built that the arrow or the bullet could hit and wouldn't penetrate it. It'd just shift because of the shape of the bone. It'd just go up over the skull and wouldn't penetrate and shoot the bear in the brain. So I've thought of that ever since, and I'm thinking, if you were going to shoot a bear and it was facing you, then you don't shoot between the eyes, but you could shoot it in an eye, or if you shot it in the end of the nose, or if its mouth is open, you'd shoot at it in the tonsils, and you might hit the spinal cord or the brain. Now, if you're shooting at a bear and it's sideways to you, the one bear that my dad shot at the garbage pit, he shot it and hit it right in the base of the ear. And that thing just, like I said, Grandpa's expression, dropped like a beef. That means it just went straight down and was dead. It wasn't any life left in it. It was done for. So I wanted to add that to my little story. Now there's one other story I want to tell you. My dad and I went to the garbage pit one time, and my father shot a bear, and the bear ran off. We found a little trail of blood, so we knew it was wounded. It was in the timber behind there. It's flat, no mountains, and the timber's quite thick, and it's good-sized pole timber at least, or a little larger, and that is this new garbage pit. So we went home, and we were telling Barney, and Barney said, well, I don't want to leave a wounded bear out there. So it's about midnight, so Barney rigs up a spotlight with banana clips on a car storage battery, puts the battery in a gunny sack, like we used to use gunny sacks for fishing sacks, so I could put it over my shoulder and carry it, and the battery's in it, and I'm carrying it, and Barney has the spotlight shining it all. So we go over to the garbage pit, Barney and I, and he takes off out there. We found the trail of blood and go into the woods. He's shining it around, shining it up in treetops, shining everywhere, trying to see if he can locate this wounded bear. And I thought about that since, and I thought, my word, Barney made a mistake that day. Nobody should have trusted me with a battery and just connected by alligator clips out in the woods at dark. If there'd have been a bear, what in the world would I have done? I'd probably done something so that I disconnected one of the clips and we'd have been out of light, out in the dark with a bear. Anyway, we didn't ever find it, and we went home, and I'm glad nothing happened that was bad about that. So I think that's interesting that Barney would do that. I don't criticize Barney for much, but when I think back about it, I think that's pretty dumb to trust me to do that. I just think it's kind of funny. Anyway, I've said I've never been able to relocate my bear rug. Last I saw it was in our storage room in our basement, and I haven't been able to find it. It was in a box, and written on the side of the box with a marker, it said bear rug, and I don't know where it is today. Have no idea where it is. But anyway, I just wanted to include that story about going looking for a wounded bear in the dark. And then I wanted to say what I did about if you're going to shoot a bear, where you'd shoot it. I want to tell something else about bears. I don't know which year it was, probably about 71. Jim Anderson and I went to British Columbia, and we were up there on a homestead for some people from Manti, and the first night after we unloaded a load of cattle, the next morning they went out and looked out over the fence to see how the cattle were doing, and they saw two bears standing up looking over the fence at the cows. They hadn't had cows there all that summer before for years probably, and so the bears were sort of intrigued, I guess, to see cows. And then Jones's son there, Michael, and Jim took guns and went back up there, and Mike shot a brown bear. They brought it into the camp. And then I told about shooting a bear in the pasture there next to the corrals near the house. But then I want to tell you, I've never had so much buck fever as I did when I was down on the corral fence looking across the creek, and there was a bear, or a big black wolf. I'd never seen a wolf before, of course, and that was just amazing to me to see that wolf. And I got a chance to look at it, and then when I went back later to see if I could see it again, then it's when a little bear came up over across the creek and came up into the field with the baled hay, and I have already told about shooting that bear. Now, I want to add to all of this bear story one more story, and this is an interesting one and really unusual. When a year or two after Louise and I were married, maybe, Warren was living on Stimpson's land, which was across the flat over by the head of Warm River. He's living in a cabin there, and he had a Great Dane dog, and he had the dog in a dog house made out of a 55-gallon barrel, and it was just out a little ways from the door to his cabin, and he put a dish out there and put dog food in the dish for the dog. Well, one night, evening, they heard a little commotion out there, and they went to see what's going on. Well, a bear had come into the yard and smelled the dog's food, I guess, and came up and was eating out of the dog dish, which was near the dog's doghouse there, and it woke up the dog, and the dog made a fuss and barked, and the bear ran up the tree that the barrel was fastened to. So the bear's up the tree, and the dog's down below, and Warren went out, and he got a spotlight, got looking up in the tree, and saw the bear up in the tree. So then there was a girl visiting there with him, and he had her come out and hold the light up so he could see the bear up in the tree, and he had a 30-40 Craig rifle, and he shot the bear, and the bear come tumbling down out of the tree and landed right next to the dog. So that was quite an interesting and almost unbelievable story. I just wanted to add that to the rest of these bear stories. Thanks. I want to add a couple of things that I remembered since I recorded before. I want to tell this story. Sam South got lost, and he was gone all overnight. One night, most of the next day, the ranger came over, brought some help, and Al was there, and other people on the crew all walked up to Tom's Creek and back in the woods, just far enough apart that they could always see each other, and walked looking to see if we could see anything of him, and never did. And the next day in the afternoon, he came walking down the railroad tracks. He was really tired and he was hungry, and I remember he went into Marjorie's house and she fixed something for him to eat. I don't know what it was, bread and milk or whatever, but he felt really hungry and was glad to get something to eat. After that, they got him back down to Idle Falls, and he didn't come back up to the mill again, as far as I know after that. Anyway, he told us that he wandered around all that night in the dark, and a good part of that time he was in water up almost to his waist sometimes. So we all figured out that he was in an area where the beavers had dammed off some of the upper part of Tom's Creek, not too far maybe from the Tom's Creek bridge in the spring. Wandered around in the timber. The timber there died from the water that the beaver pond created. Eventually it all died, but anyway, he wandered around in there through the night, and then the next day he was in there and was trying to find his way out, walking along, and he came to face with a black bear, and he didn't know what to do. Now, Sam South had one arm that was practically useless. He could carry a bucket of water in it. He just hung down, but he couldn't lift that arm up. But he could carry a bucket of water. Never bothered him at all. Didn't hurt him, didn't get tired. He could just carry it as far as he wanted. Anyway, so he was handicapped that he couldn't do much with that arm. And so he and the bear stood and looked at each other for a little while. And he wondered what was going to happen. He knew he couldn't run and get away or anything. Finally, the bear just turned and wandered off. So that was was a bear story I wanted to tell about. The other bear story I wanted to include is one spring when Barry was in Island Park. This is probably after he was married. He and Eleanor stayed up there in the winter, a couple of winters. He's over at Island Park, and in the spring, along in March, April, the snow settles, and then it gets a crust on it, so a person can walk on the crust. And they're out on the Tom's Creek Flat, and they're going up the Tom's Creek Flat towards Tom's Creek. And on that meadow, where they saw a set of grizzly bear tracks, they followed them along. They're kind of curious, followed them a long ways. And after a bit, they noticed the bear had dug all the way down through about 4 feet of snow, 3.5, 4 feet of snow, to the grass below. And there, laying on the snow, was the dried up carcass of a mouse. So he assumed that the bear's sense of smell was so good that he smelled that down through and under the snow. He dug down and got it, but when he got it up, it was dried out mouse, skeleton and hide, and really nothing to eat, so he just left it laying there in the snow. I thought that was interesting and amazing to think they can smell so good. They can find something like that clear down in the snow. So I just wanted to add those two little things. And that's all I guess I'll put on this tape. Thank you. Bye. Today is June 24th, I think. And I've been wanting for some time to make a record of my own personal involvement with bears and bear stories. And I thought I'd do it today. Sean's helping me, and so I'll start it with this. Bears, bears,